Hi there. Last time I said that Bruno has some gaps. For example, OAuth2 handling. So right now within Bruno, there's no native way to select OAuth2, for example, client credentials as a sort of authentication mechanism. So what we are going to do in this video is we're going to take a look at scripting. We'll start with a simple implementation and then going into more details step by step to introduce a sort of behavior for OAuth2 client credentials handling. So that for you, it is happening in the background. You don't need to care about it. And it's getting way easier than trying to do these steps manually. Sounds interesting? Then let's get into it. What we have is a request that is protected by OAuth2 client credentials. So if I do the request, we can see, okay, I'm getting a 4.3 forbidden error. And yeah, basically it doesn't contain the JWT token that we would expect. Now in Insomnia or Postman, I would do the following. I would simply pick, rather on the collection level, but I would pick the authentication of type OAuth2, and then I would select client credentials. This is not possible here yet. So Bruno doesn't have OAuth2 support yet, but we can work around that. Let's first do it manually. For that, we are creating a new request. Let's call it request get JWT token. It'll be a post request, and it is a post request to an endpoint providing us a JWT token. Now in here, we need to do two modifications. So in the body, we need to select a form URL encoded body, and we need to specify the grant type we're interested in. So in this case, grant type client credentials. And then as the last step, we need to provide an authentication. The authentication here is a basic authentication with the name or the username being the client ID and the password being the client secret. Now what happens if we execute the request is that we are getting back an access token. We could copy over that access token and then provide the access token in the sample as a bearer auth token. So doing this, we should have access to the request. Now, if you would do that and you imagine that you have a lot of requests in here and always copying over that bearer token, it's getting unbearable, I would say, at least for my workflow. So the next step in trying to automate that would be, okay, let's not do the bearer token in its entirety, but let's reference it somehow. So we'd use, for example, a variable bearer token. And oh damn, if you can't see the keyboard, it's really tough to type. So we have the bearer token as a variable now, and we are trying to automatically, by the response, fill this variable. So in here, we have a section called vars. Vars for variables allows you to post-response save a variable, meaning we can in here set a variable with the name bearer token and an expression. Any valid JavaScript expression. Now you need to take a look into the Bruno documentation to know what is possible. But in this case, we can do res.body.access_token. So saying, take the response, from the response, the body, and in the body, the property access token. If we save that and execute again and switch over to our sample request, we can see it is filled. Okay, so it is not anymore that we need to update it every time, but we would automatically get the bearer token in here. Now, knowing Postman or Insomnia, you probably guessed the next step. The next step is quite easy. It is to not do that in every single request, but utilize the collection. So up here, if you click that cogwheel, you get to the settings of the collection. So if we click it, and in here we are going to auth, we can also up here define that we want to have bearer auth with our bearer token. So with bearer token in here, we can quickly save that. And now it would take the authentication of the individual request. So if I do a typo in here, or if I, let's say, add something, this should fail. Okay, for one unauthorized. If we have bearer token in here, it would work, but not because of the collection, but because we have it in here. And if I now switch that one to no auth, and if I save, Then right now it is not visible that it's taking it, but it's taking the authentication mechanism of the collection. Meaning now I could simply leave every single request in here with no auth, and through the collection, it would take it and it would use this one. And this is basically what I would recommend as a very first step. But there is a better solution to it so that you can save this manual step in here, which I'm going to show you next. So speaking about a better solution, why might we want one? There are currently two steps that might be a little bit annoying. First of all, every time we are opening the collection, as it's not necessarily saved upon restarts right now, we need to execute this get jot token request. And if the jot token is why ever not valid anymore, we'd manually need to re-execute it, so without exactly knowing why, our request might potentially fail. So what we can do is we can automate this sort of step of requesting the token itself. And for this, we're going to take a look at the scripting functionalities of Bruno. So up here, you might have already seen it directly next to the auth, we have a script tab. And I'll start by just renaming the bearer token to bearer token 2 so that we can see that it's actually a new one, which we'll get. Let's start in here. What can you do with it? In the script tab, you can write JavaScript coding, including a set of inbuilt libraries or shipped libraries that Bruno delivers. You could also import your own libraries, but this is a little bit more complex. You need to do some steps in the background, so we are not going to handle that now. But in here, what you can do is you can basically execute JavaScript in front of every single request that would be run in this collection. And we'll utilize that to get a jot token in case we need one in front of a request. So let's start with that. In order to do that, we first need to import a few libraries. In this case, we'll import Axios, which is a library for doing the HTTP requests. We'll execute a library that we'll later use to turn our basic authentication into a base64 encoded one. So let's acquire 2A. And let's import one for handling dates a little bit easier. So these three libraries are available on NPM, but they are shipped with Bruno, so you don't need to download something or the like. You can simply utilize them. If you're curious on what is possible with these libraries, take a look at, for example, NPM, as usual with JavaScript libraries. Now, what would we need to do? We want to do the following. We want to request a jot token based on our client credentials in case it is not valid anymore or we don't have it yet, or we are switching an environment. So let's quickly start thinking about it. We'll need some sort of function to authenticate our client. So let's call it authenticate client. We need some configuration parameters, most probably, and then we can start defining this function. So what might we need? First of all, we need to think about our configuration. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, I already know what we need. So let me quickly type it out. We'll get a token endpoint, variable name. We'll take a client ID, variable name. We'll take a client secret, variable name, and we'll take a bearer token, variable name. And we'll take that from our, oh, come on, get out of the way, from our config that we are expecting. Now, in this case, what would this mean? We later on call this authenticate client function, and we will allow to pass in the variable name itself. So we are not defining the variable names in here. We are referencing to these environment or collection variable names. So that potentially we could simply copy the script and use it somewhere else where potentially we have different variable names. And with that, the next step that we need to take is that we need to check if the relevant variables are put in. Now, let's very quickly just start with checking if there is a bearer token var name. All right. Let's leave it with that. The bearer token, we won't store that in the environment. So later on, there is another set of variables called collection variables. Right now, if you restart Bruno, these are cleared out. And we simply want to make sure that some sort of name for that is given so that we can later on save the bearer token to that variable name. Next up, we should define when do we want to have a new token. And there are 3 conditions that need to be fulfilled for us to want to keep the token. First, we need to have one. It needs to have some validity left, and it needs to be requested for the environment that we are right now looking at. So let's build this sort of check. We can first prepare a variable that calls a function that we'll later on define that calculates the remaining time of the token. So let's call it const expiry difference in milliseconds. And let's for that later on create a function that we'll call calculate token expiry in milliseconds, which will pass in a variable, or rather a name, which is expiry for underscore, and then we'll use a variable which we'll use the bearer token name for. So in this case, we later on define a function that takes a variable later on that we still need to define. All right, then next up, we need a value to compare it against. And for this, let's simply use 1 minute, for example. So const 1 minute in milliseconds equals 60,000. And now let's do the check. So if the expiry difference in milliseconds is larger equal 1 minute in milliseconds, and at the same time, our brew.getVar, which we later on define, last requested environment name. So we later on saved the last requested environment name into a variable. Let's do it that way. And that one should be the same as our current environment. And our current environment, we can get that with brew.getEnv without any specific input parameter. And now what do we want to do if this is the case? Then we want to simply return. Because in this case, we've got a token that is still valid. It is requested for the environment that we're currently in. So we can simply return. We don't need to do anything. All right. And if we are not returned right now, we really need to get a token. Now we need to work with the constants and the config that we've defined above. Meaning what we want to do is we want to check, are they defined in our environment variables? So const env variables equals, and then let's do the following bit. We have the token endpoint var name should be brew.getEnv var, and then we have the token endpoint var name. Now, what are we doing here? You could see me previously use brew.getVar. This is for a sort of variable that you right now can't set via the interface for a collection variable. While here we are requiring the environment variable, meaning the ones that we can set in the upper right corner for the individual environments. And we want to have the following things. We want to have the token endpoint that needs to be provided. We want to have the client ID, and we want to have the client secret. So let's use all 3 of them. Let's use client ID, var name, and let's use client secret var name. Okay, and with that, we would have environment variables for these 3 values in case they are defined. But can we always rely on these 3 variables being there? No, we can't. We really need to check, are they filled in the environment variable? Are they basically with a value or not? Yet I spotted another mistake, which we should quickly correct. Up here, we've got an if statement for the if the bearer token is not filled, then throw an error. Naturally, we want to close that off here so that it looks like this. Now, unfortunately, in here, there is no pretty printer or no formatting. Yeah, if you want to do some more elaborate script, I'd really recommend to do it in a sort of code editor like Visual Studio Code. Don't rely too much on this inbuilt editor right now. It's also showing things as wrong, which are perfectly fine, which you'll see later on. So just use that if you don't have a code editor or if you're quickly copying over something somebody else provided to you. So thinking about how we could check if the environment variables are filled, we'll do that in a quick and dirty way. So let's define a constant missing variables, and that one will check the object.entries for our env variables. And there we are filtering for. Now quickly add this, wrong one, that's the right one, for key value. And in this case, we are checking for no value or value being false. And then let's map that based on the key and we'll simply return the key. Okay. Now I'm missing one brace down here. Add that and we should be fine. All right. Let me quickly zoom down a little bit. Looking at this, what do we want to do if this missing variables has entries? Let's check for the length being larger than 0. Then we want to throw a new error, which will simply say, hey, missing required environment variables. And then let's add the environment variables that we have. So let's use missing variables dot join, and we'll join on a comma and a space. And that should be it. Where is it ending? Down here. Okay. So what are we doing now? If there are some variables that don't have a value, we'll return all the concatenated properties that don't have a value out so that we know, hey, we are missing some environment variables. Now at this step, we would have checked, is the token still valid? Is it for the environment we want to get a token for? Do we have the variables that we want to have? So in the next step, what we can really do is we can start calling our OAuth token endpoint and use Axios for this one. So let's utilize a try. Then what are we going to try? We are trying to get the token data. It is an asynchronous call, so we need to await axios.post. So we are doing a post request using Axios to our env variables, and quickly get that right, token endpoint var name. Based on the value of that token endpoint var name, we're going to do a post call to that one. Then we have the body, which we'll need to fill next, which is based on grant type of client credentials. Okay, so we've got our call to the endpoint. We have a grant type client credentials. What we are missing now is the authentication. So we are going to provide another object behind that, which contains our headers, which is another object. And there we have the header authorization. Okay, so we've got our headers, which is then authorization, and now we need to provide our basic auth. So we are going to do basic. Then we want to have a variable in here. Damn it, let's find the dollar sign. And in this case, what do we want to have in here? We want to have our B2A. So we want to have it in base64 encoding. So what do we want to have in this base64 encoding? We want to have our env variable for the client ID var name, and we want to have our env variable for the client secret var name, and this separated by a colon. What are we going to do in here? We are simply passing in the very same thing again. So let me simply copy that for sake of not typing too much in here, because I'm currently always hitting the wrong things. So we have our, and that I can copy over as well, just to not type that much while not seeing the keyboard. So we have our env variable name for the client ID, var name, and for our client secret. All right. Now with that, what do we do? What do we have in here? We are doing a post call to the env variable that we have for the token endpoint var name. with the body of grant type client credentials and the header of authorization basic, and then base64 encoded our variable for the client ID and our variable for the client secret separated with a colon. Now, in case this is successful, what do we want to do? In this case, we want to set a variable. So we are taking what we got from the outside, our bearer token var name, and in there we want to set the token data access token. In the end, we want to access our token data, and on that token data, we want to grab the access token. Now, I missed one element up here, which is that we need to access the dot data on here. Now, as the next step, we want to do set variable for the expiry. What we had in here and what we are referring to above is expiry for. And we are basically again using the variable for the token. So we have our bearer token var name. Okay. And this is the current time, which will add the token data expires int. This one is in seconds. And will we format that one? Yes, we will. All right. Okay. This should be what we want to have. I've got one too many. Something is off, right? Where is it? Oh, yeah. I think this one is the problem. Yep. Okay, that should be it. So what we have now is we've got a variable expiry for our bearer token var name, which basically contains the current time plus the expiration time that we got from the token itself. So what do we want to do next? Up in the top, we refer to the last requested environment name. So let's use brew setvar and let's use last requested environment name. And for this one, the value is quite easy, which we already used above, brew get env name. Okay. So let's quickly think about what we're doing here. If we receive the token, we are setting the access token to the variable that we receive from the outside, that bearer token var name. And we are basically setting another variable, which we call expiry for, the variable name that we got. And we're using that based on the current time and adding the expires int time. And then just for the sake of our checks above, we are also setting the current environment that we last requested. All right, so this should be our success case. Now, next up, what we need to do is we have an error case, meaning we have our catch block, which will catch the error, and then we'll just do a throw error. Okay. And with that, we should have our coding itself for this function. What are we missing now? We are missing two pieces. First of all, we are referring to a function that calculates the time up, where are we? Up here, which we have not yet defined, and we have not called the function itself. Next up, let's take a look at defining this calculate token expiry in milliseconds function. So let's define this function a little bit above. Let's quickly get up here. Let's call it const calculate token expiry in milliseconds. I could quickly copy it. I think that's easier. And what do we require? We require a token expiry var name, and then we can define the function itself. In the function, we want to get the current time, which we can simply do by recording moment. We want to get the expiry time, which is either a moment of the variable that we've set, so get var token expiry var name, or let's use a fallback, just taking the current time. That should be fine for our logic as well. So if that's not defined or that's false, let's simply use the current time. And then we want to return the difference. So expiry time dot diff, and then the difference to the current time in milliseconds, as that's what we are checking against. All right, and that should already be it, at least for this one. And now what we are missing is really calling this function. So let me scroll down a little bit. Down here to the very end. Now we need to call it. How will we call it? We are awaiting authenticate client, the function that we've just defined, and we need to provide this configuration that we've also defined. So the token endpoint var name, we can simply set it as a token URL. Then what did we have? We had the client ID var name, and we can use just client ID for that one. We had the client secret var name, and for that one, let's use client secret. And last but not least, we have the bearer token var name. And for this one, we've defined bearer token 2. Now, as I said, this sort of scripting pane here is still showing errors where something is fine. So await here is marked as an error, even though it should be working perfectly fine. Yet with a short break, I noticed 3 different errors that we had still in the coding. And to save you some time, I quickly cut the video and I'm basically continuing here. When we called the await authenticate client, there was a small typo here, which was client down here, client with D, not with T. There was a typo in the last request environment name. So I had a small typo in here that you need to correct, and one larger one, which also I now corrected, which you might want to adapt as well. So looking at this access statement here, I made the mistake of not putting the bracket around the await statement. So I tried to access the data while not having it awaited, and therefore access token was called on a null value. And I added the content type. It seems like it is expecting a URL encoded submission, and you could either encode the values up here, or you're simply adding the content type, which I've done right now. So with that being fixed, let's quickly jump over and let's see how that looks like. If we're doing a sample request, we are seeing missing required environment variables, token URL, client ID, and client secret. So let's take them from our call up here. So our username is our client ID. So let's put that in. Let's take the password. And by the way, you should never show that if it's not a throwaway environment. So don't do what I'm doing right here. Then client secret, this one is a secret. Let's copy it in. And then we've got our token URL, which is the URL up here. Let's call that one token URL and let's paste it in. Now Bruno allows you to access the Chrome DevTools, and let's open them and let's see what happens. Back then we had a requesting new token. We got the error message. Let's try that again. Clear the console and let's call it requesting new one, an Axios 400. Interesting. What have we done wrong? Let's quickly take a look. We have our lovely application. There is a minus too much. So it's URL encoded together, not with a minus. So let's quickly jump back. Let's try this. And there we go. So it requested a new token and we called this sort of script. Now let's try this again. We're taking an already existing token. So I put a console.log statement up here into this one. So we can see, okay, now it's not requesting a new one. It's simply taking this one. And now if you restart Bruno, the only thing you need to do is you need to select the environment. You're doing the calls and it works. You don't need this request anymore, so you can delete it, which basically shows us that we can save a whole request with this one. And with that, we've overcome one of the gaps that Bruno currently has. Using the scripting functionality that is available within Bruno, we can automate the OAuth2 client credentials flow, even though Bruno doesn't natively support it. And this is to some extent also possible with the authorization code grant, which I'll show you in the next video. And with that, I hope you learned something about Bruno. I hope you got a feeling for what Bruno is capable of. And I hope you can benefit from the script itself. With that, until then.